Buenas tardes y
Good
bienvenido.
afternoon and welcome to each and every one of you. I'm Jeff Ramsey. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsht Latin American Center. Here at the AALAC, have sought to find a peaceful and democratic solution to the crisis in Venezuela. We know that the best way to shore up democratic institutions in Venezuela is through credible elections in Venezuela that could lead to an election that the international community could recognize. In the coming months here at the council, we will try to maximize the opportunities for reaching a solution to the crisis. In order to move forward, we're going to need three things. One, nonpartisan debate here in Washington about the negotiations and the importance of the agreements, also a coordinated international response supporting political agreements, and then the need to ensure coordination between the public and private sectors to advance these agreements. This is a crucial time for Venezuela. So it was important for us to have a discussion about the upcoming elections on July 28th. Even though the conditions are far from international standards, the Venezuelan opposition and the international community nevertheless see them as an opportunity. The candidacy of Maria Corina Machado and Corina Llordes have been undermined. But this does not undermine the opposition. We are here today to consider the standpoint of Venezuelans vis-a-vis these elections. For that, we have panelists and some things very clear in the polling. The Venezuelan people are anxious to vote. There's no interest in not turning out or boycotting the elections. Now, there are challenges for the opposition and the international community in terms of how to tackle these challenges. We will be considering that in the coming days, weeks, and months. To discuss this today, we will be having a 3D conversation. We have Delphos, Data Analysis, and DatenCorp. Many people in Washington talk about what Venezuelans think and what they want for their country. But today we want to hear from specialists who have those data, uh, firsthand data. These are three of the most credible pollsters in Venezuela, and their data are well accepted by everyone in the country. This event is being broadcast live via Efecto Escudo, thanks to the Efecto Cocuyo group. This conversation will be moderated by Luz Mele Reyes, director and co-founder of Efecto Cocuyo. Yesterday, she was appointed fellow at the International Center for Journalists. Yes, let's give Luz Mele a round of applause on this. I will give her the floor so she can introduce our panelists and moderate our discussion. If you have questions, those of you here in person or those of you following us online, you can in, go to askac.org. Askac.org. You can put your questions into that platform. Thank you. Welcome to this discussion where we're going to look at the Venezuelans' view of the elections. We are going to give each of our presenters 8 minutes to present some figures and some positions. Then we will move on to Q&A. Thereafter, we will hear from your questions, and we're going to pack this all into an hour. Hopefully, we will be able to manage that. Today is April 2nd, 2024. We are broadcasting this through the Atlantic Council social networks and Efecto Cocu. I will first give the floor to Jesus Eguias, the president of Dutton Corp. You have 8 minutes. Thank you very much. And you're going to have to be bad cop here. First, we're going to take a look at the profile of today's Venezuelan. After 25 years of political turmoil, we have a country that has been destroyed in all senses of the word, including at an emotional level. And this is a country that operates at zero sum. It's going nowhere. Not the government, the opposition, or independents, even criminals who have taken control of the country. Nothing's going well for anyone. The entire country desires change. 80% of Venezuelans want change. And I would even dare to say that the other 20% do too. So nothing is going to stop that change from coming. We're going to start with this slide because the matter of the elections is one of the hottest topics we're discussing now. So, who would Venezuelans vote for if the presidential elections were held tomorrow? So, here, and we just asked them to select one candidate. And those who said, I don't know, or said that they were not going to vote, we excluded them. Maria Corina Machado would carry 73% of the votes, Nicolas Maduro 19%. If there were other candidates, all of them together barely reach 8%. So this is saying that if the opposition were to try to push any other candidate, it wouldn't have much of an impact. Now, this is the first issue for Maria Corina Machado because her major strength now becomes her main weakness. And that is why the government decided to bar her from running. Because if she were allowed to run, that would not just be a matter of elections, it would be a very deep political decision, very sensitive, because what the government would be saying was, okay, fine, here we're just putting our hands up. We're going to turn power over to our worst enemy. And I really don't think that the regime is ready to accept such a scenario. So the government's saying we're going to hold elections. There was a lot of manipulation here, and only who the government considers somebody worthy of taking the reins of power can run. And if they weren't to win, because this is politics at the end of the day, they would have to guarantee that they're turning the reins of power over to someone who would guarantee their political survival, that they will not be brought to justice, they will not be persecuted. This is one of the realities. They are the ones in power. They control power. They have the power of coercion. And I believe that the government right now in Venezuela has more power than the opposition. So it's not just enough to have the majority, you have to use that majority. That is where we find ourselves right now. What would Venezuelans advise Maria Corina Machado to do if she is not allowed to run? One is take to the streets and protest until the bitter end, 12%. Call on people to not turn out and vote, to 7%. Support another candidate who is allowed to run. That is 70% of Venezuelans, and 11% had no opinion. This presents an interesting scenario, and we're going to see in later slides how this plays out. Those who support Maria Corina Machado, if they cross a number of variables, 70% of those who support her are saying, okay, fine, go out and find a different candidate who can run, who can participate, who can win, and who could actually triumph and then use that win. That is what Venezuelans are asking Maria Corina Machado to do. If the candidates were just Nicolas Maduro, a unitary platform candidate, whoever that may be, who would they vote for? Nicolas Maduro, 14%, and for any unitary platform candidate, whoever that may be, 53%.
We see here an overwhelming victory. And then if you cut the respondents down to just those who would vote, then Nicolas Maduro would receive 21%, and that unnamed unitary candidate would get 79% of the vote. And what this reveals is a number of realities. First of all, there's no doubt that Maria Corina Machado really capitalized on discontent. There was an internal crisis, mistrust of politicians. 70% of Venezuelans don't trust politicians, especially the opposition ones, even more than the government politicians. And she overcame that. And so she has that trust of the people in the streets. She emotionally appeals to people, and that emotional connection, that's the gem in any politician's crown. I want to tell you something. Venezuelans don't tend to follow strongmen, not even Chavez. What they want are tangible results. Give me tangible results. That's what they want. If you're the right person, I will follow. But if you're not producing results, you're just talking and you're not responsive, then we'll turn somewhere else. And that's what happened to Juan Guaido. Juan Guaido was in a position similar to Machado's position now, and people were massively supporting him. He brought about hope. But when that hope dissipated, people turned away from him, seemingly overnight. Maria Corina Machado, as a political leader, must look at this. Don't get too excited about that victory and understand that Venezuelans aren't going to follow anyone blindly. What they want, the only thing they want at this juncture, is for us to move on to the next panelist because your 8 minutes are up. But I just want to finish with one very brief thing. I don't know why some politicians make things so hard for the Venezuelans when things are pretty cut and dry. They're making things hard for the country, for the international community, and for the US. It's time to go with reality and make decisions because 2024 is here and we don't want to be in this situation in 2030. Thank you, Jesus. So we have Felix Cejas, the director of Delphos. You now have 8 minutes. All right. Looking ahead, we're going to talk about 4 points and the main characteristics of this election year. First of all, we've seen elections take center stage. That is undeniable. We are seeing numbers that we never saw before. The primaries had a lot to do with that. And I don't want to get into too many details because I don't want my microphone taken away from me. But We had the primaries, and that really triggered everything that we're seeing now. The fact that the elections are the main hot topic now. And especially since other approaches have seemed to fail. So 70% of Venezuelans believe that elections are the best way to move forward. 80% are likely voters. At this time, and we're not talking about whom they favor, just how they feel about elections in general. 80% said they would vote. And in the case of definitively barring Maria Corina Machado, still we have 70% of Venezuelans saying we should not give up on elections. So elections are what people want. That's the path that Venezuelans want us to stay on. Now, the idea of the unitary platform and unity, that's what people want. It's not that they really necessarily want change. They want better living conditions. They understand that that will only happen, however, if there's a political change. So the real candidate here is unity, the unitary platform. And they get the sense that politicians are just working in the interest of politicians and not the good of everyone. Who would vote for Machado? We know that she has a massive lead, but without her, what happens? If you have someone supported by her, they would get 50% of the vote. Now, this isn't the trimmed down numbers that we just saw. This is including the people who said they wouldn't vote at all. So 50% would opt for a candidate designated by her and by the unitary platform. And that's very close to the figures for how many people would vote for her. So whether it's her or someone that everyone can agree on, it's about the same. Now, if she doesn't support anyone, if she doesn't run and she doesn't support another candidate, say she calls for people to stay home from the polls, then the votes for the uh, opposition candidate drops to 25%, but 20% say it depends on the candidate. And this is interesting because the primaries really called into question legitimacy, and the victor wasn't really her. It was like what happened in Capriles with 2000 in 2012. It's what this did was legitimize the efforts of the unitary platform. And because of that, because of the great majority that turned out for her, that's why it makes sense to have her and the platform designate someone. If they don't, we see a drop in the intentions to vote. So a lot has to do, of course, with communications, campaigns, et cetera. Perhaps that number could be brought up or could be brought up a lot, but there would be that initial impact that we see here. The regime has a hard time connecting with its non-hardcore base. It's a problem they've had for some time. We've seen it in previous elections. They haven't been able to mobilize people the way they were accustomed to doing in the past. The uh, greatest share potential uh, they could have is about 30%, but you have that soft segment. So about half of those people, those are the ones that they have a hard time mobilizing. They see Maduro's administration as negative and they're just unmotivated, not engaged. And so the question for the Chavez camp is how to get them excited. How, how do you mobilize them? It, through economic factors, without a better economy, it won't happen. And the election results could influence people's decision to emigrate or not. 25% of respondents said that they're thinking of leaving the country. And of those people, 2 of 3 would stay if the opposition were to win the election. That is the massive impact that would be brought about by an opposition victory. And 4 of every 5 would leave sooner if the current regime were to win again. So if they win, there could be a major risk of a massive outflow of migrants. So I see you looking at me. I will pass on the mic. Thank you very much, Luis Vicente Leon, President of Data Analysis. You can send in questions. I see that we have some, so you just, Jeff, could you repeat the app that you use for questions? Yes, send your questions there, and then we will, after we hear from Mr. Leon, we'll ask some questions. Well, first of all, I'm happy to be here. I'm not going to delve as much into the issue of candidates, among other reasons, because, all the numbers are equivalent. They're pretty consistent across polls. Maria Corina Machado is a clear favorite, but I would add, however, that between November and March, once it was known that she'd be barred, we did, in numerical terms, see a decline in support for her because automatically people are trying to figure out how will that get resolved, who will replace her. So we saw a notable decline. That doesn't mean that she's not still enjoying a majority of support. She is more support than anyone else. But in effect, unity is just in general, the idea of a unitary candidate is as popular as she is. And so, can we have a clear candidate there, or will it be more complicated? So, it's useful, I think, to have a framework. If you want to analyze the likelihood of a transition in Venezuela or the quality of the negotiation processes underway, then you're in the realm of political theory. And if you study that, you'll see that right now the conditions for a transition are very clear. If you want a transition, you have to significantly reduce the costs of leaving for the person in power, because otherwise they will refuse any kind of negotiation. They're not going to go for anything that is going to harm them. And you have to raise the cost of remaining. If the cost of remaining is low and the cost of relinquishing power is high, then it's very unlikely that anyone is going to participate in negotiations. Right now, the conditions are just not in place. Neither of these two conditions are in place that would enable us to imagine a negotiated, easy solution, especially not with the current negotiation process. If we look at it now, it has to do more with, it's more like the negotiation of an exchange of prisoners. Sure, if you're trying to keep people from starving, that's where progress has been made. But the only thing that's truly going to have an impact is to reduce the cost to Maduro of leaving. And that's not there yet. You need to have incentives and threats, carrots and sticks, and they're not sufficient for enough for us to believe that he will give any ground. The government, until such a negotiation occurs, if it occurs in the future, will most likely try to avoid any major risk. And given that, what do we have? let's see. I don't, something happened to this slide. It doesn't look like it should. So we analyzed what would happen in a pretty obvious situation. Machado is barred. We asked, so if she is barred, what would the alternatives be? We'll never say never, but it's highly unlikely that she will be allowed to run because the regime doesn't want to encourage the vote. They don't want that kind of strong opposition. So the likelihood that she will be allowed to run is virtually zero. So, or it, the likelihood converges to zero. So if she's not allowed to run, which is the most likely scenario, then what alternatives do you think are best at this time? 75.1% of the population believe that the opposition should find an alternative candidate. So just find somebody, while just 11% believe that the opposition should try to delegitimize the whole elections process.
So then is a substantial difference compared to 2018 when people preferred to stay away from the polls. That is not the same case today. So if we say, okay, it's very likely that an alternate candidate designated directly by Maria Corina Machado is also prevented from running, in it would they consider someone that if she were to have them as a parallel candidate? So the problem for Maduro is not Maria Corina Machado. His problem is Maduro. His main weakness is his lack of popularity. So he's going to have to do some sort of magic to make the minority into majority. That can be done in many ways. Some people say it will be through fraud, it will be through trickery. No, taking advantage of people who don't turn out or who don't. I think it's impossible for Maduro to win the elections. If you call on people to not vote, he could win even with all the international observers there, because at the end of the day, he only have the votes that we're seeing now. We're seeing an evolution of candidates. Even Chavez in most of his elections started be far below what he ultimately received in terms of votes. So we know that Corina Jordis is also going to be barred from running. So we said, would you uh, be willing to support an alternate candidate appointed by the unitary platform, even if it were not the choice of Maria Corina Machado? You can see that most say that they would. If we're talking about the unitary platform, here, this is not talking about a perfect unity, even partial unity. There are people who continue to be willing to support that candidate. Well, about 20% would say that you would have to denounce as fraud any substitute candidate. So there are opportunities for another candidate. Then we asked, which of the following options would you support? 71.7% state that international negotiations should continue to guarantee certain electoral conditions for the presidential elections, as well as the 2025 regional and parliamentary elections, even with Maria Corina Machado being barred from running. And talk about continuing further with the negotiations, there is a major rejection of the possibility of even with the barring of Maria Corina Machado, say that if the that sanction should be tightened. because this would lead to an increase in migration, worsening economic situation, reduced oil revenues, etc. Thank you, Luis Vicente. We have already received a number of questions that we will share. I will start with one that Laura Diptewala has put forth, and you said it came out in Seguia's slides. When you collected these data, I think yours is the most recent. It's hot off the presses. With knowing today about the official candidacies, if we were to know them, bearing in mind this conduct that we've seen, how this could be affecting those candidates who are already there. Well, ours were through March 25th. Things are very volatile. It's volatile for what we've already said. The truth is, Maria Corina Machado, who has a great deal of backing, the backing is not for her. It's support for change, the desire for change to happen. And I think that's really relevant. This is not tied to a single person. It's tied to the possibility for change. Here we have changes. Okay, who are the candidates? We know the candidates are, as Puca would say, Eugenio Martinez. You know that there's some deadlines, which in practice don't tell us much of anything. There could be challenges between now and April 20th. What we might see are the challenges to certain of these candidates, and then everything is upended because the favorite candidate might not be allowed to run. This is very complex. Do we know who the candidates are? Maria Corina Machado said she's going to continue to fight for her own rights. You know, she has been barred. I think that her being barred from running is unconstitutional. And people have a right to defend themselves and till the end, until June 18th, there could still be negotiations in which any of the candidates might change for Corina Yordis or Maria Corina Machado. These are all possibilities, and we're not going to know until we get very close to the elections and what the final list of candidates will be. I have a question here. This is for you, Felix. This has to do with migrants. This individual says many migrants have said they will return home, the offer by the president of Mexico. What would their position be vis-a-vis the current regime? And this came from Radio Miami Internacional. You are the one who brought up the matter of the impact of the elections, or if the opposition were to win on the matter of migration, because this is one of the points that continues to come up in discussions in the United States in terms of reinstating relations with Venezuela. A study was done mid 2023. It seems in Venezuelan time, that seems like it was centuries ago, but there was a multi-year study that looked at migration where there were much of the opposition migrated. The composition of these migrants is very similar to the political preferences nationwide. So let's say we're saying 60% of people are part of the opposition and 30% are pro Chavez, and then some others were not sure. I think migrants would fall into those same patterns. I have a question. Since Eugenio is here, Eugenio asked this, and is the endorsement of Machado necessary for overcoming perhaps the bad reputation of a potential candidate? Look, e- everything's on the table. Eugenio, come on, you could have thrown me a softball. Think of it this way. First, in, in Maria Corina Machado's word, her position carries a very heavy weight, and there's no doubt about that. The destiny of a country depends and relies on the leadership of any given leader. And I think her endorsement would be enough for Venezuelans. We did surveys after, and we asked about a candidate who is no longer a candidate or a potential candidate because that individual was not accepted. But people said that they wouldn't even have 1 or 2 points. And when we said that candidate, whoever they might be, that that person, that individual would have a 35 percentage advantage, whoever it were to be. Right now, the whoever the candidate is tied to the possibility of change. This is 25 years. Even for a government that had done things well, people want change. So when people are in front of a screen where it says, here you have Maduro, you get 6 more years of him, and here is an unknown candidate, who would you vote for? I have no doubt what the response would be because what Venezuelans want is change. And we have some more questions here. This comes with the voting in blank by the Chavistas. We've heard a lot of discussion about the opposition, but we don't know very much about what's happening in the Chavista base. So would they vote in blank? And someone else adds that amongst the Chavista candidates, are there any more popular than Nicolas Maduro? Was that something that came up in your polls? In terms of the vote, if there were a strong opposition candidate, I think that the sort of soft base of Chavistas might abstain. So Maria Corina Machado for Chavistas, it would be a radical vote. They cannot connect to her. And so, yeah, they're a soft base, but even if they're a soft base, they may not agree with the person. They might feel like they were somehow endangered. Now, if the unity candidate would have that profile, there's some who would prefer to simply not turn out to vote. Maduro's got to make a significant effort. He's got to uh, convert the minority into a majority. He needs those votes to be cast. So if the Chavista soft base doesn't turn out to vote, that's going to be a problem. As far as Chavistas are concerned, we did consider some of the alternate candidates. Now, while a significant part of Chavez followers believe that Maduro should seek an alternate or a substitute, someone to replace him, there is no candidate, well, except for one, who has a position that would be exceed that of Maduro. Rafael Lacan, who is somebody who's a bit younger, a bit more modern, a candidate. And in the polls, yes, he does do better than other Chavista candidates and would even be competitive with an opposition candidate. What about your studies about the soft base of Chavistas? Those are some of the questions we're getting from the public. Between 10 and 15% of Chavistas are willing to consider other options. We had a panel that we consult when something happens, and from that panel, we found that a small segment did vote in the opposition primaries and they voted for Maria Corina. They are willing to vote for change. Now, there's something very curious about them, and this I could have shown this if I had 30 more slides. Some parts of Chavistas are curious about what's happening in the opposition. They're tired. They want their standard of living to improve, and they're willing to consider something different. In an interesting qualitative study, we found that the soft base of Chavismo, we wanted to know what they were thinking. They think that what's happening right now in the opposition is a type of renewal, something new. And Maria Corina represents this renewal. That's quite striking. That could be radical. They said, well, yeah, sure, that's fine. And she's tough. She's tough, and that's the way a government should be. They see that reflected in Maria Corina. They don't connect her to anything else. It's very strange, but they are not connecting her to a past. Why? Because they don't associate her with the Mesa Única, with any of the opposition of the past. They see her as some renewal, like a renaissance. And I'm talking about the soft base of Chavismo, a select group, but that does exist.
Sí. Bueno, los estudios
Do you
nuestros,
have a comment on that? Well, when we look at the various variables of moderate Chavists, in terms of their profile, they tend to lean towards negotiations, zero confrontation. They like to find solutions to problems based on the studies we've done, the household surveys. They don't want to see persecution of Chavez. They don't want constant confrontation. And it's interesting. Those most in favor of negotiations are the Chavez, even the hardcore ones. They're the ones that have the strongest leanings in that regard. According to all the analyses we've done and the variables we've studied, 20% of Venezuelans are radical opposition. They have a different attitude. Why? Because they approach it more emotionally than rationally. They're mad, rightfully so. They're full of hatred and vengeance. They want to punish those responsible for the crisis. And this happens in every country. And in Venezuela, it's a minority, a very vocal minority, but they give the wrong impression. There's that silent majority that is really on a different page. So 70% for that reason say if Machado can't find someone else. Some months ago, there was a lot of talk about her as an outsider. We have several candidates. We see the numbers. So there's still room for an outsider, it would seem. And some of the questions ask about Benjamin Roseo. If you don't know him, he's a Venezuelan who didn't participate in the primaries, and what might be said about him running now? Is there an appetite for having an outsider? And in that case, do you see a possibility for him? The outsider issue, that's always going to exist to the extent that there's no unity. So if you can actually create hope around there being a unitary platform, uh, either Machado or someone put forward by the platform, that's who is going to get the preference. And then they'll forget about the outsider. They would love to have somebody who brings people together, who's supported. So connecting to that question, you can have a candidate with popularity issues. There are many examples over history. But if that person becomes the unitary candidate, then that is going to trump any issues they had with popularity, even if there were some image issues. I just, unity trumps everything. But if there is no unity, that's important. We're talking about what people want or what we want, but if you analyze it from the standpoint of likelihood of happening, then it's not necessarily a high probability scenario. If if you can't get unity because you've got Machado and you've got the unitary platform and there's complexity there alone, but they're not on the playing field alone. You also have the government and of course the last thing the government wants is any kind of unity. So this isn't easy to achieve. And if it's not achieved, then the outsider becomes a new factor. If you're testing candidates against one another when there is no unity candidate, then in our polls, numerically, Bernardo does get some significant numbers. 8 months ago, it hurt him that he wasn't in the primaries, and people thought that he had withdrawn from the election as a whole, not just the primaries, but his position could enable him to become a player if there's no unity, or could also cause trouble for a non-unity candidate. So it is a player in a scenario where there's no unity, but only then. Did you want to comment on that, or can we continue with the questions? I have a question that I wanted to pose. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and ask a question. We have 13 candidates. All of them are men. And so my question has to do with how to read that. She's been subject to criticism because she's a woman, but is there anything that you're getting in your polls in terms of women versus men? Well, it's true. She won the primaries with over 90% of the vote, but they don't want, I mean, they haven't wanted a woman president before. Something I remember a year and a half ago. Actually, people don't care. If you're forced to vote, they choose a man. That's also true. And we've tried to dig into why. But generally, people don't express a preference. I don't think that it's a major factor right now. Venezuelan women have shown that they have a lot more courage than men and an ability to respond to situations, address situations. This was really not premeditated that there would be just male candidates and women would be removed. It just so happened. Well, to tack onto that, it is circumstantial, but if we're talking about public opinion, if we get into politics, that's different. That's true internally in the political world. They're very tough on women. It's a terrible environment internally. But I was speaking to public opinion, which is different. Well, I totally agree that in terms of polling elections, it doesn't seem to be relevant whether the candidate's a woman or a man. And I'd say, however, that in this case, it's actually a positive to be a woman because people are looking for change. So to the extent it is a factor, it's it's a pro. Even internally within the opposition, it's harder to attack Maria Corina Machado because she is a woman. It's also true that there are attacks that are classic in politics that are thrown at any politician. But then in this case, you can say, oh, it's misogyny, it's discriminatory, even if men can say the worst things to each other and that claim can't be made. So if a woman gets involved in politics, yes, she has to be prepared to be attacked like any other politician. All right, I won't dig deeper into that because that isn't the topic at hand, but I did think it was important to address the gender issue. So another question, actually, I think there's some we can combine. How could you explain that in the 2021 elections, there were more opposition mayors than ever before in history, despite divides? Doesn't this mean that even in this scenario, he's defeatable? Maduro is defeatable? Looking at those 2021 results, which really made people see that there was a change in the rural vote that hadn't been seen before. It was usually the urban population that tended to carry more weight in terms of overall results. Defeatable? Of course. He is at risk in any election because you can control institutions, you can control the money, but you can't control all electoral variables. What happened with Machado shows that despite the money, the institutions, that didn't give the results that Maduro had hoped for. So any elections for Maduro are risky. Now, as to the mayoral races, there were many more, yes, but the total votes for the opposition would have to be even higher. You would have had to see the same pattern in governors as well, because the opposition is the majority right now. But that doesn't mean that if you think back to 2018, Henry Falcon in all uh, polls also was winning. He was winning in the polls. He was supposed to get more votes than Maduro in 2018. And what happened? The fracture, the uh, abstention caused Maduro to win. It was that magic of turning majorities into minorities by causing rifts. All right, well, we only have 3 minutes left. There are many questions having to do with your methodology, and so it would be important to clarify what the difficulties there are in Venezuela for opinion polls, because there might be, fake polls out there too, no? There's a myth surrounding polling. We do household surveys. We go to the furthest reaches of the countries, and we've never had trouble, and voters have never had any hesitancy in talking about how they're going to vote. Venezuelans aren't afraid to say what they think. They they do that, and so we actually conduct polls in the regular way. I have a question here. How could international observers help pollsters like you in understanding the will of the people? I'm just going to read it as it was. I'm not sure if I really understood the question. But in any event, there are other questions having to do with the question of who legitimizes the election. Is it the National Electoral Council? Is it the support of the unitary platform, international observers? Have you been able to find out anything about the credibility of the elections and who would carry more weight and having people believe the results were credible? When we say most people want to vote and believe in voting, and they don't want to abandon that. That doesn't mean that everybody thinks that this CNE is an angel. Quite the contrary. Despite the fact that people know what they know, they want to keep to that path. Venezuelans know what's what, but they know that what successes there have happened in the electoral realm, and that's where they'll continue to happen. It's a low cost option. It's not going to cost you your life, and you can get results. In terms of high risk actions, things have turned out worse. So it's a basic equation. It's pretty easy for people to figure out. Nobody is deluded, not on the Chavista side, not on the opposition side. Okay, I'll approach the question as follows. You can't look at processes in a static way, like what we see right here is going to define the future. All of this is dynamic, it's fluid, it's happening. If we were to put it in order of priority, what makes the election legitimate? Oh, well, for the government to allow the platform's candidate to have the platform agree. If you have unity of the unitary platform and the government allows their candidate to run, then yes. How do you know if it's a competitive election? I'd say that the 2024 election will not be a competitive election, meaning it has the conditions that we all understand in a liberal democracy. It won't be competitive, but will it be semi-competitive? Or not at all competitive? That's really the question. Which of those two alternatives? It'll be semi-competitive if you can see some semblance of choice, something that you could actually grasp. And it would be very important for the election to be semi-competitive. It'd be important for the US because the US is also desperately trying to find an excuse to not go back to what it did before, and it didn't work. Sanctions were a total failure. US doesn't want to go back. If you have a non-competitive election or it's called off, then we're back to square one. But if Maria Corina supports a candidate, even if it's last minute, that could give it some legitimacy, some semblance of competitiveness. But even if there are rifts or if she pushes for abstention, I think that given the desire to participate and the fact that the platform has a candidate, that will already give the election some legitimacy. And I'll wrap up with one last thing. You can have a candidate that doesn't meet any of those conditions, but in this polarization process, it could capitalize on popular support. And if that person can do that and get popular backing, then that will create legitimacy, because what matters is what the people want and what they vote for. Well, I don't think I'm allowed to extend this. It's already 6:03. I think that, yes, we do have some final questions. We'll convey those to our guests. But for now, we are wrapping up. Thank you very much to everyone.
Quiero que aunque el norte y sur sean distintos, lleven un mismo latido en el ritmo, como quien comparte el mismo apellido, porque al fin y al cabo somos latinos. Quiero que la unión que logra la fuerza rompa divisiones y abra más puertas. Quiero que entendamos que cuando todos sumamos se hace la diferencia. Diversos como hay palabras en el diccionario, todos los significados usan el mismo abecedario. Yo soy como tú eres como yo.